short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
American and Israeli forces targeted Iranian air defenses, missile and drone launch sites, and regime buildings. Hours later, the extraordinary announcement the supreme leader had been killed.
We're hitting them surgically, overwhelmingly, and unapologetically.
This is not a necessary war. It's a war of choice.
The reality of the war in Iran is showing up at gas stations nationwide.
Oh, the gas prices going up is very frustrating.
These are short-term actions and short-term price fluctuations for the long-term benefit of ending the threat that Iran poses to the United States of America.
Iranian attacks have left the world's busiest oil shipping lane, the Strait of Hormuz, impassable tonight.
If there's a diplomatic resolution to this, I think the Strait is going to play a central role.
President Trump has announced a last-minute deal between the U.S. and Iran, a temporary ceasefire brokered by Pakistan.
They'd like to make a deal very badly. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. And we agreed to a lot of things, but they didn't agree to that. And I think they will agree to it. I'm almost sure of it. In fact, I am sure of it. If they don't agree, there's no deal.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Daily Report, Setting It Straight. I'm Lindsey Reiser, live from the CBS Broadcast Center in New York. Tonight, we're going to break down the latest developments in the war with Iran and take a deeper dive into how we got here. We'll explore why it's affecting everything from gas prices to grocery sticker shock and how soon things can be resolved. So let's start with today's developments. Israel has agreed to a U.S. brokered ceasefire with Lebanon. It started at 5 p.m. Eastern this evening. President Trump also says he will likely host the leaders of Israel and Lebanon sometime in the coming days. What about direct talks with Iran? Well, here's the president on his way to Las Vegas earlier today.
When is the next in-person round of negotiations on the war in Iran? When will
They're
that
all
take place?
important. I mean, it's not a question of around. All of them are
When
important.
will the next in-person
Probably,
meeting take place?
maybe over the weekend.
It has been 47 days since the U.S. and Israel launched attacks. So how did we get here? The Trump administration's stated goals were to remove Iranian leadership, destroy its navy and missile capabilities, ensure it can never have a nuclear weapon, and prevent it from funding and supporting proxies. But things got complicated quickly when Iran shut down the critical waterway you've been hearing a lot about, the Strait of Hormuz. It's a narrow stretch of water only about 21 miles long that connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. 20% of the world's oil flows through the strait. Any disruption causes fluctuation to the oil market, which impacts our gas prices, groceries, and airfares. Currently, we are in a ceasefire that lasts until early next week. Under the terms of that ceasefire, Iran is supposed to open the strait, but there is still no permanent solution. To complicate matters further, since Monday, the U.S. has implemented a blockade of Iranian ports, blocking all maritime trade in Iran. The goal is to put economic pressure on the regime after peace talks broke down in Islamabad over the weekend. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth spoke about the blockade earlier at the Pentagon.
In the meantime, and for as long as it takes, we will maintain this blockade, successful blockade. But if Iran chooses poorly, then they will have a blockade and bombs dropping on infrastructure, power, and energy.
Let's bring in CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. Weijia, thank you for being here. So let's start with this 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. President Trump says he'll be inviting Bibi Netanyahu, the Lebanese president, as well, to the White House. What more do we know about how significant of a development this is?
Well, this is critical to the broader peace deal, Lindsey, because after the president announced a ceasefire with Iran earlier this month, there was fighting the next day between Israel and Hezbollah based in Lebanon. And because there was not an agreement with regard to whether Lebanon was part of that ceasefire, and Iran insisted that it was, but Israel and U.S. Had other views on that. And so now that they are able to have this ceasefire within a ceasefire, it certainly makes the bigger one easier to try to hash out. Although that one, we should mention, Lindsey, is expiring in about 6 days. You'll remember the president announced a 2-week ceasefire with Iran to try to reach a permanent deal. So we're looking at next week, and that's why it's so critical that these talks happen.
And the president traveled to Las Vegas to tout his no taxes on tips policy. But new CBS polling shows 63% of Americans describe the condition of the U.S. economy as bad. How is the administration looking to reshape this narrative?
Well, you're seeing it. We just watched the president depart here to head to Las Vegas to have one of two events out west. Tomorrow he will be having another campaign-style rally in Arizona because he's taking his economic message on the road. Now, this is an indirect response to the Iran war, but it's certainly related. The president had always planned to pick up his travel as we inch closer to the midterm elections, but perhaps now more than ever, it is critical because just like the numbers you mentioned there, Americans really are feeling the economic pain of this war. And as we talk about the Strait of Hormuz and all the uncertainty around that, one thing is clear, and that is gas prices are still high, higher than Americans would like to be paying. So the president is trying to shift the focus on other more popular economic policies, such as no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. But, you know, when you look at our polling alone, not to mention several other polls that sort of tell the same story, you know, people are frustrated with the prices of food, of gas, you know, of how jobs are going here and the housing market. So the president has a heavy lift ahead of him to try to convince Americans that this is a temporary setback when it comes to oil and gas prices, and that ultimately Americans will save more money under his administration.
Weijia Jiang, thank you.
Sure.
CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata joins us now from Tel Aviv. So, Charlie, can you give us a sense of what this naval blockade looks like in practice, and what would happen to a ship that tries to evade it?
Yeah, so, Lindsay, exactly what it looks like right now is the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier is the centerpiece of this blockade. That is with warplanes taking off the deck, doing surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, looking at where the ships are. But the ones that are doing the hard work are 10 to 11 destroyers that are inside that region, south of the Strait of Hormuz. And those are operating the interdiction operations and missions. And they're literally sending out these radio signals to passing ships saying, if you have come from a port in Iran, you need to turn around right now. And we learned from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, today at a Pentagon briefing that 14 ships, probably more than that now, and counting, have been turned around.
Okay, let's get back to basics. For those who don't know, remind us, what is the purpose of blocking this crucial passageway, and what will it take to reopen it?
Right. So let's take it back a couple of weeks ago, where Iran essentially imposed their own blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, partly because they kind of own that territory. They own the entire shore, and it is a narrow strip. We talk about 20 miles of that strip, but really, it's between 2 and 4 miles where ships can pass through, and it's very close to Iranian waters, where Iran has essentially had a siege on it. So a few days ago, the United States announced its own blockade, and it might sound counterintuitive, the United States imposing its own blockade in order to break Iran's blockade. It's imperative, it's important to point out here that the United States hasn't gone up to the Strait of Hormuz and owned that territory, which is still Iranian. It would put U.S. warships in peril, within reach of Iranian drones and missile strikes. So essentially what's happened here is Iran has sort of been forced to open up that strait for ships to pass through. The United States has interdicted or intercepted 14 Iranian-flagged ships, turned them back. So it's a blockade fighting a blockade. And the reason this matters so much is because the oil and resources and all kinds of other resources throughout the world are dependent on that strait to stay open. So it's not open. The Iranians still have a chokehold and a pinch point on that. The United States has got that as well. But ships are moving through that strait, and the United States has some ownership of at least some of the transit in that region.
Okay, Charlie D'Agata, thank you. Earlier today in the Pentagon, we heard from Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Dan Kane about the ongoing naval blockade of Iranian ports.
Let me be clear. This blockade applies to all ships, regardless of nationality, heading into or from Iranian ports. More than 10,000 sailors, Marines, and airmen, over a dozen ships and dozens of aircraft are executing this mission.
Let's bring in retired U.S. Navy Admiral James Fogo. He's also Dean at the Center for Maritime Strategy. Admiral, thank you so much for being here. Is this blockade something the Navy trains for? And how do U.S. forces know which ships are heading to Iranian ports and which are not?
Thanks, Lindsey. Great to be here with you today. So we do train for this. And in the case of the aircraft carriers and the expeditionary strike groups, the marine amphibious units that are floating around out there, the ones I'm familiar with train off the Virginia Capes, where I was stationed in Norfolk. And they come out of maintenance. They're certified to go to sea. They start basic block training, and they get in some very sophisticated training, gunnery training, helicopter training, naval gunfire training, hostile vessel boarding, search and seizure training, which could come in handy, maritime interdiction operations. So they're certified by a fleet commander before they go, and that's why we're always ready. That's why those ships were so successful in the Red Sea for the last 2 years. How do we know which ones inbound or outbound or bound for Iran or coming for Iran or paid a toll or have Iranian oil on them? Because we have exquisite intelligence, human intelligence, intelligence coming from the ships that are out there, signals intelligence, and airborne intelligence. And with all that, we get a big picture, and we can figure out who the bad guys are and who we want to stop or turn around.
Have we ever implemented a blockade of this magnitude before?
Yes, we have. This is old hat to the United States Navy. We've tried a blockade on the Barbary pirates during the Barbary Wars. And remember the Civil War, Union ships sent ships down to the southern ports to blockade the Confederacy. That was a cost-imposing strategy that essentially brought the Confederacy to its knees. They couldn't get gunpowder, guns, uniforms, food, and eventually they couldn't keep up with the industrial North. So this is something we know how to do.
Admiral, let's say diplomacy fails. What would it take militarily for the U.S. to force the Strait of Hormuz to reopen?
Well, let's hope it doesn't fail. But if we have to go in, then we would do it with the preponderance of force, with combat air patrol overhead. Keep in mind, the Iranians still have a lot of fast attack craft that are very dangerous. They have guns, they have missiles, they have explosive shaped charges. They also have the Shahed drones. They have thousands of them. We've proven that there are still a few missiles left because we did lose the F-15, but we got the pilots back, thank goodness. So if this turns into a kinetic fight, it will be high risk, risk to mission and risk to force. But we can do it. That's what the Navy and the Marine Corps trained for. And that's why those carrier strike groups, soon to be 3, and the 2 amphibious readiness groups are out there if we need to do that.
Admiral James Fogo, thank you.
Thank you.
When it comes to increased costs, the war is appearing to have an impact on many aspects of American life, from transportation to travel to food production.
It's like driving a lot for very little money. It feels like giving like free rides.
Usually be about $500 for the round trip ticket. It was $1,000. We canceled the business trip.
Our liquid nitrogen that we run went up, $100, $150 a ton. So seeing those huge increases right here at planting time really did kind of hit a lot of farmers hard, including us.
CBS News senior business and tech correspondent Jolene Kent joins us now. So how is the average U.S. consumer being impacted by the war when it comes to the cost of everyday goods?
Lindsay, you heard those folks there explaining how their individual lives have been impacted. And really, it's two things. It's inflation, which is up 3.3%. That's the first report we got. A look at how the Iran war is impacting overall that headline inflation number, the price that you're paying and how fast it's going up. The other thing to look at, of course, gas prices. I don't know how many times we've talked about this, but according to the latest CPI data, it's up more than 20% month to month. That's the fastest rise since 1967. And in terms of everyday items of how much more you might be paying, we actually don't see a major increase just yet. But we do anticipate, according to economic analysis, that we could see that gas price trickle down when it comes to transporting of your goods, and that could eventually hit grocery prices in the next inflation report.
So let's talk travel transportation. We heard about that guy in the airport saying it was usually a $500 ticket. Now it's $1,000. How are people reacting to increased fuel costs and these added surcharges?
Well, I just know anecdotally, so many people are telling us, both as we're interviewing folks for CBS News, as well as, in our friend groups, that people are delaying or canceling trips due to the cost of airfare. And part of the reason is they're starting to see not just the overall prices rise, but baggage fees are being jacked up by at least 4 airlines: JetBlue, Southwest, Delta, United, all raising their bag fees. Spirit Airlines may have to be forced to go into liquidation due in part to rising gas prices. We also saw flight fares overall jump 3.4%. And so that's not super significant yet when it comes to the inflation on that price overall. But what we're going to be focused on is what happens to people's psychology, that inflationary psychology, as they head into the summer when it's high driving season. Ideally, you want to get on a plane and go somewhere, perhaps for a family vacation. And that is really going to show us how it impacts consumers. But you already feel that sort of crunch for people's budgets month to month. And now we're going to be seeing that when it comes to that discretionary spending.
Have to be quick with you, but diesel affects pretty much everything, right? Can you explain how interconnected everything is?
Yeah, basically diesel helps transport all the goods that you and I need at the grocery store and beyond. And so when that price spikes as it has, it is likely to impact prices. We also can't, forget the cost of fertilizer also going up. Those inputs really important for our farmers. You heard that farmer earlier talk about how that is driving up the cost of being able to grow and harvest items. So across the board, we expect to see in the coming month that data reflect the reality that so many of us are already feeling, whether it's at the checkout, especially at the gas pump, of course, Lindsay.
Okay, Jolene Kent, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Coming up, Wall Street rebounds. We just talked to Joe about Main Street, but a market rally wipes out war-driven damages on Wall Street. We'll explain why stocks are climbing. You're watching The Daily Report, setting it straight. Stocks on Wall Street rose to new highs today, adding to the record gains seen yesterday. And it comes as investors express optimism that a resolution to the war in Iran can be reached quickly. The Dow Jones closed the day up 115 points, the Nasdaq up 86 points, S&P 500 up 18 points. CBS News' Kelly O'Grady joins us now with more. So I watched your social video. You broke it down with Biggie.
Yes, he was there. Very important economic analysis.
You bored him, but not me. But how do you describe this rally?
So, look, I think it's a little bit of vibes, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I want to take us back a year to when all of the chaos with tariffs were happening and we saw huge swings in the market. And then things calmed down because investors saw through that uncertainty. They saw through the chaos. And something very similar is happening right now. You see that oil prices have gone down. U.S. crude prices are well below $100, still above 90. OK, it's not like we're anywhere close to where we were before the war. But investors are seeing through this and they're saying, OK, we hope that these round 2 of negotiations are going to happen. We hope that there is a deal that could certainly change. But that's really what's driving this. And so that's why I say it's vibes, because it's really more optimism than anything. The other thing, by the way, totally unrelated, earnings season just started. And the big banks reported very strong results. And that is an early indication we could see other companies report the same.
So can we expect more fluctuations?
Absolutely, because the second that an energy infrastructure gets bombed or the ceasefire is off or whatever it might be, you see oil prices rise. Remember, there was one day where it rose close to 15% in one day, U.S. crude, and you saw the market react, in response to that. And so I think you're going to see a lot of this. Don't check your 401k for a bit. Same advice I gave everyone with tariffs. But remember, we saw all that volatility with tariffs, and then we hit record highs. And we're kind of there again, where investors are just saying, OK, we've been here before. We've seen it up and down. And we want to capitalize on some of these companies that were undersold or they're oversold, and they were able to get back into a good price.
We touched on some of this with Joe, but can you explain, why does one 21-mile-long passageway in the Middle East affect almost everything of what we pay?
Close to 20% of the world's oil and gas goes through that. And so, yeah, we might not get our oil from there, but other people do. And when they can't, when China, when other countries can't get the oil that they normally buy from there, well, they still demand the same amount. So it's simple economics. When that demand is there, but the supply globally shrinks, prices for everything goes up. And just when it comes to oil, that goes into everything. Diesel, what it costs to transport your Amazon packages, what it costs to plant, the food that we're going to see ultimately in a couple of months when we go to the grocery stores. It just trickles into everything. But yeah, it's kind of crazy, right? Something in the Middle East and we're so far away, it really does impact it because oil is a global commodity.
Kelly O'Grady, thank you. After the break, more on how the war is hitting Main Street.
People are struggling, is what I see. And it seems to be a universal, everyone seems to be having a difficult time.
What people are saying about how the war is hitting their wallets. You're watching the Daily Report, Setting It Straight. After weeks of enduring skyrocketing gas prices following the start of the war, drivers appear to be seeing at least some relief at the pump. The average price for a gallon of self-serve regular is $4.05 a gallon. That's down 10 cents from last year, but still last week, but still 26 cents more than we were paying just a month ago. Prior to the start of the war, the U.S. Energy Information Administration predicted gas prices would average around $2.95 a gallon for 2027. Now it puts that number at $3.46 a gallon. President Trump has repeatedly predicted prices will plummet once the situation in Iran has stabilized and the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. Earlier this week, our Lilia Luciano spoke with a top executive at Chevron who said drivers will also benefit from a new increase in supply coming from Venezuela, which is now being refined in the U.S.
There's about 600,000 or 700,000 barrels a day of Venezuelan crude coming to the U.S. That's driving down supply costs so we can buy that product cheaper. That's translating to lower prices. It's just getting dwarfed by what's happening in Iran. Long term, this is a good thing for Venezuelans. It's a good thing for Americans because it will drive down prices.
Patrick DeHaan joins us now. He is the head of petroleum analysis at gas price tracking website Gas Buddy. So, Patrick, let's get your take on that sound from Chevron. How much of our recent price increase has to do with the actual supply and demand?
Well, a lot of it. The market is looking at current situations, the current blockage of the Strait, which is now ongoing, closing in on 50 days. And that's a very real amount of crude oil. Looking at 20 million barrels a day, 50 days, we're talking about a number closer to 1 billion barrels of oil lost through the Strait of Hormuz shutdown. So this is one of the highest level impacts that I've ever seen in my career of doing this. And the impact certainly could continue or worsen in the weeks ahead.
Well, yesterday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent predicted that prices will return to around $3 a gallon sometime between June and September. But he also said gas stations will play a major role in that. Let's listen to that part.
We are going to be watching the gas stations because they raise prices very quickly when when the crude oil prices went up. We hope they'll bring them down just as quickly as crude oil prices have come down, which they've come down substantially just in the past 10 days.
How does a gas station decide its prices? How far into the future do they speculate before setting the price for today?
Well, they look at their replacement cost, whether up or down. And many times stations only can be successful waiting 2 to 4 days to start assessing that replacement cost, whether higher or lower. And that's because stations on average refill their tanks every 2 to 4 days, meaning if a station buys at a higher price today, it's going to have a lot of difficulty passing that along when most of its competitors haven't yet bought. And so to the Treasury Secretary's point, there is actually somewhat of a delay in prices going up. That allows analysts like me to give you a forewarning. And there is a lag on the downside as well because stations then are recouping losses that they sustained when prices were actively climbing.
Patrick DeHaan, thank you. And you can track how the war in Iran is affecting gas and oil prices at cbsnews.com/gas prices. Coming up in our next half hour, the war remains top of mind for President Trump. We're taking a closer look at his objectives for the conflict and where they stand. You're watching a special edition of the Daily Report, Setting It Straight. President Trump has repeatedly claimed the war with Iran is almost over. He has also stated multiple times the U.S. is close to accomplishing all of its goals in Iran. We wanted to track where things stand now, starting with destroying Iran's offensive missiles. U.S. Defense Department officials have said 80% of Iran's air defense systems have been destroyed, along with more than 450 ballistic missile storage facilities. But U.S. intelligence agencies have assessed Iran still has an arsenal of offensive missiles, many of which are buried, and Iran is starting to dig them out. In fact, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced this today during a Pentagon briefing.
While you are digging out which is exactly what you're doing, digging out of bombed out and devastated facilities, we are only getting stronger.
The second stated American goal is to annihilate Iran's Navy. The Pentagon claims to have destroyed more than 90% of Iran's Navy by late March, but Iran has been able to attack at least 22 foreign ships, according to shipping data tracker Kepler. This and the weekend's failed initial peace talks has led to the current standoff in the Strait with the U.S. enforced blockade. To prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, U.S. and Israeli forces have heavily targeted nuclear facilities in Iran. The International Atomic Energy Agency estimated last June that Iran had about 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has acknowledged that at least some of that enriched uranium is still in Iran, and that the U.S. could launch a ground operation to seize it if Iran doesn't willingly surrender it. But CBS News national security analyst Aaron McLean said that mission would, quote, not only be the riskiest special operations in military history, but also the largest. The Trump administration wanted to ensure that Iran could not arm, fund, or oversee, quote, terrorist armies outside its borders. Israel has aggressively bombed and launched a ground invasion of Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah. Even during the current U.S. and Iran ceasefire, Israel had continued bombing Lebanon, though today Israel announced it will only do so in response to, quote, imminent threats from Hezbollah. Finally, President Trump called for regime change in Iran, as he explained during remarks the night the war in Iran began.
Finally, to the great, proud people of Iran, I say tonight that the hour of your freedom is at hand. Stay sheltered. Don't leave your home. It's very dangerous outside. Bombs will be dropping everywhere. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations.
President Trump has claimed this goal has been accomplished because airstrikes from U.S. and Israeli forces have killed multiple senior Iranian officials, including Ayatollah Khamenei. But the structure of Iran's theocratic government is still intact, and Khamenei's son, who's also a hardliner, is the new supreme leader. CBS News Chief Washington analyst Robert Costa joins me now. Bob, nearly 7 weeks in, do you think the president's still expected to be in this conflict with no clear end in sight?
Great to be with you. Based on my conversations with sources close to President Trump, he does not have an ideological perspective here in terms of seeking to nation build or to overhaul the Middle East. He really sees this as a targeted conflict where he wants to annihilate Iran's ability to be a major player militarily in the region with access to the development of nuclear weapons. And so it's really an end game where if a deal comes to the table that is appealing to him, that feels like there's economic stability for the United States and its allies, he'll take it. It's not about stretching the war on forever just to continue to bombard Iran.
John Alterman, the Brzezinski Chair in Global Security Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, told me Tuesday the Iranians think they can take more pain than we can, partly because they're not democratic. They're not really worried about elections. Is the president or are members of his party worried about how this is playing domestically?
When I was up on Capitol Hill in recent days, there is consternation about the cost of this war, about Congress being left out of the discussion in terms of war powers. The president took executive action here to move forward militarily, and some members of Congress in both parties are exasperated about that. And they do believe on the Republican side there could be a political cost, but not so much about the strategy of the war. And we saw Republicans 20 years ago with the war in Iraq feel a lot of political pain at times because of the Bush administration's strategy in Iraq. The fallout here is really economic, as you've discussed previously on the show. If gas prices go up, if inflation remains a problem in some places, the war could be part of the cloud that hangs over many voters when they think about this administration and go to the polls.
What do you make of the Vance versus Rubio storyline that seems to have gotten more fuel during this conflict?
Well, there's not some kind of major standoff behind the scenes. It's more about instincts. Vice President Vance clearly has non-interventionist instincts on foreign policy, and he's articulated that both privately, I'm told, and publicly. We've seen in many of his speeches. He's not exactly in line with President Trump's approach to go into Iran in this way, but he's been supportive of the policy. So the divide is really about kind of the origin of how Secretary Rubio and Vice President Vance approach foreign policy. There is a bit of a rift there, but it's not a rift in the active day-to-day policy making inside the White House.
Robert Costa, thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong. In the meantime, discussions are ongoing.
That was the president delivering an address on the war just over 2 weeks ago. This week, President Trump said the war was close to over, but with only about a week left of the ceasefire, we still don't have an update on when peace talks will resume. Michael Duran joins me now. He's a senior fellow and director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. Thank you for being here. I do want to play something that former National Security Advisor John Bolton told CBS News 24/7 earlier this week.
Well, the first thing is to find out what his objective is. And to this day, I can't say that I fully understand what his objective is, unless you want to live under the threats that it poses, the nuclear threat, the terrorist threat, the threat to the global economy we see playing out now in the Strait of Hormuz. Unless you want to live with those, if you can't change a regime's behavior, the only alternative is change the regime.
So we need to keep in mind Bolton and the president aren't exactly on friendly terms, but President Trump said the people they're talking to are very reasonable. Do you think that the only way to measure success is through true regime change?
No, I think there is a possibility of behavior change. And if we see that the Iranians, if we learn next week that they've given up their enriched uranium, which the president has said is one of his key goals, and they've given up the ability to enrich on Iranian soil, I think that'll be a pretty good indication that there's a behavior change afoot.
What does success in the Strait look like at this point?
I think success is giving up the enriched uranium, giving up the ability to enrich it on the ground, opening up the Strait of Hormuz, and some indication that Iran is no longer going to support the proxies around the region. I would add to that, of course, also the ballistic missiles. But I think that's the hardest one to guarantee. But if you want to see behavior change, the support for the proxies and the nuclear program are the things that are the easiest to track.
Why do you think that it would be the hardest to prevent them from restockpiling missiles?
Well, because they've already got a lot in the stockpiles, and they're deeply buried underground where it's hard for us to reach. The production of the missiles is entirely indigenous in Iran, and so it's a lot harder for us to influence that from the outside. Of course, that has to be part of the deal, but it's a little bit easier for them to hide stuff underground and put it where we can't get anything. We can't get to it, and you can't sanction it away either.
Michael Duran, thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone that I speak with is seeing a change. People are struggling.
I just had a half tank of gas, and it was over $60. And normally a full tank is about $60.
So you're getting half as much.
Getting half as much.
My check is getting smaller and smaller by the day. It's just these diesel prices is out of control.
It's raising the prices fraudulently, and it's not a war, so I'm not sure what we're hoping to accomplish, but boy, something's happening.
Some of what Americans think about the conflict and its impact on the economy. Although President Trump has said the war is close to being over and the operation has been a success, recent data finds Americans aren't completely convinced. A CBS News poll conducted last week found the percentage of Americans who think the conflict is going well has fallen from March down to 41%. The percentage of people who think it's going badly has risen to 59%. CBS News national correspondent Lana Zak is in Davenport, Iowa, where she's been talking to people. You did those interviews. What stuck out to you?
Hi there, Lindsay. People are really tired of the uncertainty of all of it. I hear over and over again from the people, and I've been crisscrossing the state of Iowa talking to folks in small towns. Many of those people were traveling along I-80. That's that major artery that connects the east and the west coast. So people who really have been struggling with the price of gas, they were telling me that they just feel like they continue to work as hard as ever, and the economy and all these other factors just seem like they are set against them. I'm going to play you a little bit of sound from a waitress in DeWitt, Iowa, Christiana Casaberry. Here's what she had to say.
I have little ones at home, so definitely groceries, very, very expensive. We're trying to stay afloat.
She says that her advice to lawmakers is that they're trying to survive. She just wants them to put things back to normal. You know, she says she has the best, most loyal customers there in DeWitt, Iowa, but there are less people who are coming into the restaurant. And even though they're continuing to provide good tips, and she has good owners of that restaurant, she says looking out for her, that it just feels like they've been trying to get back to where they were before COVID. And now it just seems like everything keeps pushing them back again and again. And we're hearing that from people across the Midwest and in the middle class. It's a real challenge.
I mean, that's one of the first things to go, right, is your spending on eating out and those other things that are sort of ancillary. I do wonder what people make of the messaging from the White House, because we keep hearing short-term costs for long-term gains. Are you finding, Lana, if we still have you, that people agree with that, or is the messaging an issue?
And they don't really see how that works out for them. They're seeing people in Washington who are talking about the importance of this, but it's much more pressing, their ability to fill up their gas tank to get to work. It's particularly true in farming communities. It's particularly true for truckers, as you heard that truck driver tell me. And I want to play a little bit of sound from Jolene Medic. She was at that I-80 truck stop with me today, and she volunteered how she felt about the war.
Nobody has said, this is what we're trying to accomplish, this is our goal, we're trying to, whatever it is, defeat the bad guys, it's fine. Nobody said that. And we don't even know what we're fighting about. Why? It wasn't declared. It wasn't stated out in a sentence. Nobody knows.
And that matches up with what we are hearing from our latest ABC News poll. The question: have Americans had the mission, the objectives clearly explained to them? 34% of Americans say yes, but 66% agree with Jolene, saying that they haven't really heard the reason why we're fighting this war, but they are seeing that the implications for them are higher prices, and they're frustrated about that, Lindsay.
Lana, Zach, we really appreciate your reporting. Thank you. Up next, the President v. Pope controversy is not abating. The fallout and whether this could cause long-term damage between the U.S. and the Vatican. You're watching the Daily Report, setting it straight. Since the early days of the war with Iran, President Trump has alluded to getting involved militarily in the Strait of Hormuz to ensure safe passage for ships. Our CBS News Washington team gathered some of his comments, and we wanted to show what's changed over the course of the nearly 7-week-long war. 4 days in, the president made his first comments in response to Iranian attacks on ships crossing the strait. He said on Truth Social, quote, if necessary, the United States Navy will begin escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible. No matter what, the United States will ensure the free flow of energy to the world. Then about 6 days later, he told CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang he was still, quote, thinking about taking it over. In social media posts and press comments after his conversation with Weijia, that he claimed the U.S. and other nations would send military assets to keep the strait open.
Numerous countries have told me they're on the way. Some are very enthusiastic about it, and some aren't.
But things took a severe turn on March 21st. In a Truth Social post, President Trump said if Iran doesn't fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. On March 23rd, President Trump extended the deadline by 5 days. On March 26th, he extended it another 10 days. But on April 4th, the president doubled down on his threat. And in a profane message on Easter Sunday, he claimed, quote, Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day. During a press conference the day before the so-called Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, the president said this to the press.
The entire country could be taken out in one night, and that night might be tomorrow night.
Last Tuesday morning, the president warned in a message that raised alarm bells globally. You'll remember this. He said, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. However, less than 2 hours before that Tuesday night deadline, the president announced a ceasefire as long as the strait reopened. Earlier this week, President Trump turned his criticism toward an unlikely subject, Pope Leo. The president wrote in part on Truth Social, quote, Pope Leo is weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy. The Pope spoke out publicly against the war with Iran, and the Pope said he is spreading the message of the church and has no fear of the Trump administration, but we've already seen some potential fallout. Police in Illinois responded to a bomb threat at the home of the Pope's brother. Authorities say they found no explosives, but the incident remains under investigation. It's unclear whether the threat was in direct response to Pope Leo's comments, but the timing has sparked speculation they are connected. Joining us now is Michael O'Loughlin. He is the executive editor of the National Catholic Reporter. The war with Iran is already so politically fraught. So what kind of backlash could the president face now that he's attacking the Pope and also posting these controversial AI images of himself online?
When President Trump attacked the Pope over the weekend, there was an immediate reaction from Catholics in the United States and around the world who took issue with attacking Pope Leo, the first Pope of the United States. Pope Leo responded by saying he was talking about Catholic principles, that he's not a politician. President Trump kept the story going today, telling reporters earlier that he felt like he had to attack Pope Leo because of his opposition to the war in Iran. So this story keeps going. I think U.S. Catholics are offended whether they supported President Trump or not. So we'll have to see how they react come November when they have the chance to vote at the ballot box about what they think about this attack.
How does the Pope typically approach a divisive issue like a war?
Pope Leo has talked about Catholic principles. He said that he is upholding the gospel, that he wants ordinary Catholics to apply those principles in the public square. He said that he's not a politician. But President Trump is approaching Pope Leo as if he is another Democratic politician and using methods that have worked in politics, but seem to be hitting some resistance here with Pope Leo being a religious leader and not a political leader.
Do you see this causing long-term damage between the U.S. and Vatican?
It certainly seems like the relationship is pretty chilly right now. Both the president and vice president have attacked the Pope, who's from the United States, who understands the cultural and political context here. I can't imagine that this will be easily healed, though Pope Leo does want to continue to engage Catholics in his home country. So I think there's a chance for healing and forgiveness. Of course, it's the Pope, so he's all about forgiveness and charity. But we'll have to see if the White House is willing to offer an apology for this sort of attack on Pope Leo.
Michael O'Loughlin, thank you. Still to come, we've talked about the war's impact on things like gas and groceries, but what about costs that are far from every day? How the conflict overseas is affecting mortgages. You're watching a special edition of the Daily Report, Setting It Straight. Mortgage rates have been steadily climbing ever since Iran restricted access to the Strait of Hormuz. The average 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is at 6.3% for the week ending yesterday. The good news is that's down from 6.83% at this time last year. Here to help us understand that paradox is CBS News business contributor Javier David. He's also a business editor at the Dallas Morning News. So why does the Iran war and closure of the Strait impact the housing market?
Yeah, so whenever you're talking about mortgage rates, it's always instructed to pay attention to what's happening in treasury yields, the government bond market. So those rates trickle down to mortgage costs. So in the case of the Iran war, we've had all this volatility. It's been wreaking havoc on markets, and it's also sort of wreaked havoc on government bond yields. So in turn, mortgage rates have followed suit. They've been higher than what we expect. It's put both buyers and sellers in a bind. You have all this geopolitical turbulence. It's undermining investor confidence, consumer confidence. It makes employers hesitant to hire. It creates all of this generalized uncertainty that helps nobody. So all of that means you're keeping mortgage rates higher and above 6%. It's just kind of prohibitively expensive, especially for first-time home buyers.
And that said, rates aren't as high as they were a year ago. So why is that?
Yeah, we've had a lot of volatility in the market, so it's just keeping things, scrambling things. But inflation is playing a really big role here, and I don't think that we talk about it enough because inflation expectations drive up interest rates, and higher interest rates, higher mortgage rates. So recent events have made things clear that we're still suffering from price pressures. Everything's biased to the upside. We've had some climb down in mortgage rates, but all of the uncertainty, you're sort of like start and you go higher and then you go lower. But then the big picture is no one is certain about where things are headed, and they are reluctant to buy, they're reluctant to sell, and that has an impact on mortgage prices.
So I have about 30 seconds with you, but what does that mean for the market in general with all this uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, just two things home buyers really need at this point. They need a definitive end to this Iran conflict, and they really need some sort of definitive cooling in inflation pressures. That would help send Treasury yields lower. It would prompt a dip in mortgage rates. But unfortunately, right now, buyers and sellers are in this kind of limbo, and the only one profiting from it really are banks, and which incidentally reported really good earnings. So they're doing just fine this week.
Javier David, thank you. Up next is CBS News 24/7 Prime Time. Thank you for watching. We hope you've learned something and taken something away. I'm Lindsey Reiser. This has been a special edition of the Daily Report, Setting It Straight.